Resonant Earth offers a number of entry points in thinking about ceramics as contemporary form, how it is able to problematize its own artistic provenance and suggest its trajectories. From a singular object in its annotation in Zobel's essay, the exhibition proposes different ways of thinking about the history and future of Philippine ceramics. Zobel's essay historicizes the development of ceramics in the Philippines as a cosmopolitan enterprise. In the painter's account, while Japanese experts trained Filipino artisans and artistic motifs derived from European design, clay comes from locally sourced mines. The transformation from clay to ceramics is embedded in this cosmopolitan economy that is global in its lineage but local in its aspiration. This cosmopolitan inflection also plays out in the choice of artists for the exhibition. Based in Dallas, Hanna Pettyjohn's work takes inspiration from the practice of her parents, John and Tessie Pettyjohn, pioneers of Philippine ceramics. In her two-dimensional works, she translates geological tropes such as topography, layer, texture as elements of figuration. Joseph Gabriel studied ceramics formally in London and works professionally in stoneware design. His practice is attentive to the materiality of stone and ceramics, keen on exploring possibilities of the form. Pam Quinto, for her part, uses ceramics as part of her interdisciplinary practice. In her works, ceramics converses with other forms and materialities, from texts, photographs, painting, and even scent, moss, or salt. A series of works by Joseph Gabriel speculate on the material conditions of the dish documented by Zobel's essay. As the essay describes the plate, and I quote, molded dish of thin porcelain, translucent and sonant, with scalloped edge, undulant shoulders, and raised foot. White body covered inside with a light gray slip and decorated with a design of iris blossoms and leaves executed in transparent mauve and blue enamels and heavy blue green and white enamels within a decorative border in the same. The outside is covered with a thick, glossy, cold white overglaze. End of quote. From this documentation, Gabriel crafts new forms inspired by his stylistic close reading of the piece. From shards of stone to three-dimensional tubular extrusions based off of the artist's abstraction of the dish's visual language, to ceramic forms made by clumping together delicate porcelain flowers into a composite sculpture resembling a hollow stone, Gabriel's work for the exhibition offers a keen understanding of how the materiality of the object may allude to the material's possibilities and afterlife. Taking interest in the historical and geographic dimensions of the essay, Hanna Pettyjohn extrapolates an alternative history of porcelain production in the Philippines. While Zobel's account speaks of local sources of kaolin in Makiling, Calamba, Bulacan, Pettyjohn's research reveals that there is no existing record of kaolin mines in these locations. For her work in the exhibition, Pettyjohn leans into a speculative possibility for the Philippine ceramics industry, wherein a reliable source of kaolin may be found in its vicinity. Two paintings play out this speculation. One paints a fictional kaolin mine inspired by the landscape of Mount Makiling, where the artist spent her younger years. A body of water lies at the center of the landscape, its surface still and flat green blue. This artificial body of water indicates the presence of kaolin, and its unique coloration can be seen from satellite imaging. In juxtaposition, the two works seemingly mimic the activity of zooming in and out of digital maps. One moves closer toward the smaller work and moves away to take in the expanse of the larger work. Pam Quinto constellates historical and discursive moments in the development of ceramics and nominates possible itineraries for thinking about its cosmopolitan character. One of the figures central in her imagination is the French Jesuit priest Francois d'Entrecol, who was an industrial spy who went to China, learned about porcelain techniques, and sent his discoveries back to France in 1712. D'Entrecol's letters contained recipes for the production of porcelain and inspired the practice of keeping commonplace books that contained recipes and trade secrets. Quinto fabricates a possible commonplace book for La Porcelanica and presents, and I quote, a speculative archive of what would have been recorded on Francisco Quintos's or the factory's commonplace book. One is a recipe for a porcelain clay body and firing instructions, a blend of information based on Entercol's account of Chinese secrets to porcelain production and the Japanese production method for aritayaki porcelain. The other page is designed for a teapot based on the La Porcelanica plates motifs and Japanese cloisonne enamel vases. From the procedure of stylistic close reading in Gabriel to the mapping of speculative genealogies in Pettyjohn to Quinto's alternative itineraries of cosmopolitan craft, Resonant Earth presents how curatorial, art historical, and artistic agencies may generate discursive methodologies with which to articulate speculative possibilities for the practice and its forms. In the hands of these artists, and as in the alchemical transmutation of raw clay into ceramics, earth becomes resonant, mobilized to speak to and converse with the prolific contexts of artistic agency, art historical contingencies, and the discursive conditions of imagining the future of and for Philippine ceramics.
So right now I'm working in a design studio based here in London. So I have that part of my practice where it's more looking at ceramics in a more manufacturing terms. And then the other, I also work in a university in a ceramics department. So it's looking at ceramics as a mode of expression. But with my own artistic practice, I was also trying to kind of deconstruct this in my mind. Like this is more of, like trying to speculate based on what's left. And in this essay, I think what's really odd is we only have a single sample. Like looking at this particular object in terms of its formal elements, so reducing it into colors, lines, texture, etc. That's also related to my painting background, or looking at ceramics as a substrate of marks, or like something that can capture marks. I was really struck with how um, Zobel, as the writer, positioned a certain framing of the narrative. So I think it was clear from the very start that he's claiming that this is the first Philippine porcelain, and how this relates to his father who founded La Porcelanica. But I was talking to Pam about, when La Porcelanica ceased to operate, like what could have happened to the equipment. You cannot just say that you only have, okay, maybe in the essay you only have one sample, but at least a description of the products of La Porcelanica, as a collection. Like I was looking at that kind of side of the essay. So there's really a strong um, urge to fill in the gaps between these missing information and how it really coincides with the historical background of like ceramic practice in the Philippines. When I read the essay and I was planning about the whole work, I felt really stuck at first. So I was mostly doing digital iterations, like using the image from the essay and translating it into a 3D object. But then I carried on with some linear elements that I simplified. So the first one I created for this exhibition is the work called Extrusions. So they all came from a singular template, which you extrude, then just thinking about different ways of making it iterations. And for this exhibition, I was really conscious about not making it too didactic or I think too definite, but rather giving myself and the audience an opportunity to look at it in different perspective or different light. So let's say for the rocks, I was looking at kaolin as a subject matter as opposed to it being a component of my material. So I was looking at images of kaolin rocks and thinking what could have what it could have looked like if it had different colors the same way I was looking at the plate. Um, what could have been the color palette of a certain collection. One of the most important works for this exhibition for me is the series called Memento. So I think that was one of the first attempt into creating a work, but that didn't really come to fruition until I revisited the molds. So I was creating a floral motif, which are like really flat, but I couldn't really come up with how to piece everything together. So I think one of the key elements in my artistic practice is this recurring idea of fragments of what remains and trying to look at it in various perspectives. And I guess ceramics as a medium has brought me to understand the underlying context of materials and objects and how we find certain associations with them. So with Memento, um, I was looking at floral elements, but not really in a overt way that these are actually flowers. So I was just looking at it and trying to piece together in a way that it could come up. I could come up with a form that could be grasped, but not quite entirely. So that's why I opted to make it hollow forms. So I was looking at the relationship of the object and also the possible human gesture that you can relate to it, although it's physically absent. Part of creating the work has to do with my process with dealing with grief or coping with someone who passed away recently, and I was thinking like maybe these flowers could have been for them, and that distance between something that is there but you just want to grasp it but you can't, like trying to channel a certain way of making and putting that into an object. That's why I called it Memento. They're all varied because how I see it is, the act of experimentation is a form of material inquiry. I think it was really necessary to see this as a form of visual language or form of expression, uh, that they might be completely different from each other, but they are all parts and parcel of the object or the source of the object, which is the porcelain plate. It's really important um, to look at the sense of place in terms of how I position my art practice. I think being away from home, which is the Philippines, I tend to always revisit what is familiar through my works, like by referencing certain natural elements, or that that idea also gives me a chance to infuse something that is quite uncanny or unfamiliar. So also try to see it on a more imagined form. I think there are similarities in terms of sensibilities, how we choose a certain subject matter. Hannah's painting, there's something about it that I find really fascinating, that it speaks to me in a lot of ways. The element of surprise that gives you working with other people, even if it's not really planned, but it just unfolds in a very interesting way.
Parents are potters, and I grew up around clay. And I guess I grew up just seeing the whole process of ceramics from beginning to end. So there are like these images that really stick with me from my childhood, like seeing the sacks of like soil that my parents would source from all over the place, and then they brought it home in their pickup. And I'd see the whole process, like the earth getting ground up and mixed with other stuff. And I was exposed to a different way of looking at clay. And I was able to experiment without like being influenced to go one way or another. And I had a lot of freedom to do my own thing. So that's what brought me to the practice. My approach was like, I really liked the idea how there could have been a porcelain tradition in the Philippines and a native source of kaolin. And I really liked how in the essay that a lot of the traditions and materials came together and ended up in one place, which was embodied in the plate. The way that ceramics influenced me was just sort of like I was taking into consideration the sourcing of the materials. I think there's still like an inherent awareness of what goes into your clay and where it's sourced from. And you may have some idea of like what kind of environments produce what clay or which clay is from which place. I think like taking material into consideration like informed my work for this show. My paintings are like a way for me to talk about the connection that people have to their land and to their environment. And I try to achieve like certain textures and capture some visuals that you see when you look at layers of rock and earth. And I wanted to like have a theme of like materiality and landscape behind my paintings. I found it really interesting because it's like the idea, yeah, like I said earlier, that there could have been a porcelain tradition in the Philippines and a source of kaolin in the Philippines, in some place that's so easily accessible. And I guess growing up, since I was so exposed to the process of making clay, I really focused on this aspect. So I showed the essay to my dad, and he said that he checked out makiling clay from a few sites listed in the Bureau of Mines survey from the early 1900s. And he said there was no kaolin there. And as far as he knows, it's not something that you're likely to find in a volcanic setting. Interestingly, though, there's like a barangay near Makiling called Puting Lupa, but he says that the clay there is bentonite and not kaolin. And there are a few like kaolin sources in the Philippines, but none that are really accessible. So we both like wondered if the essay was at least partially fiction. So when I was researching my work, I really considered the idea that there could have been a kaolin mine in Calamba, which is where I grew up, which is next to Mount Makiling. I was really interested in the idea that Calamba could have been like Cornwall, which is a big mining province in the UK. St. Austell's the name of the town where the kaolin is. I began looking at images, both like actual and satellite images of kaolin mines around the world. There's a lot of kaolin deposits in Georgia, here in the US, around a town called Sandersville, which is kind of near Atlanta. And I think this was because it used to be a coastline in prehistoric times. I found this documentary called Eat White Dirt by a filmmaker called Adam Forrester. And he talks about the Sandersville area. And it was really interesting to see the pride they had around the industry. Like they have a kaolin festival with a parade. So like seeing the tie that they had to the land was like something that really impacted me. And I was like imagining it like for myself, like, and to see like a people and culture shaped by the relationship between an industry that relies on a natural resource. And it's a resource that I have a lot of personal ties to. I also really like the blue-green water that you find in the kaolin mines. And I think it happens because the white of the kaolin makes the water really opaque and white like paper. And then there's mica in it, which is a reflective mineral, and it reflects the color of the sky. So I wanted to take like all of this and apply it to the landscape that I grew up in, like a landscape that I'm like really familiar with, and just like layer all these ideas and layer the images in Photoshop and like form like a speculative culture and geology. So my two paintings were like the cumulative result of all of it. Because yeah, layering is like a theme in my work. And I wanted to use the layers to make a fictional landscape and to make like an alternative history of Filipino porcelain and portray a fictional kaolin mine. Yeah, I made a composite image against the Makiling landscape. I would Google a lot of satellite images, and like I started to notice the blue-green water that you could see from really far away. So there was like a constant like zooming in and out, using the bodies of water as like an anchor point. And that became part of like the process of like gathering information to create the work. I always try to capture some of the process in the work that I do. So like lately I've been incorporating like the gray and white checkers, which is like a working layer of Photoshop, into my painting. So it seemed like appropriate to try and get some of the process in the viewing experience as well. So the viewer steps back to see the larger work, and forward to see the small work. So it's like replicating the zooming action. So I think living here, somehow it makes the land I grew up in so much more precious. Like I feel like I can understand it better also in a way, because I can see it from afar, from like a different angle. And I find myself trying to make connections between like here and there by comparing what's the same and what's different. It made me very aware of the way goods travel around the world, since I send most of my work home either by air or by balikbayan box. And I feel like this affects the way I make work in terms of like its size and its shape and the fragility. And I also see that in like Jazz's work. I really like how we have similar backgrounds. Like we were all painting majors in UP. And then we all took these different paths and went to different places, but then we ended up in one show and like approaching the same prompt, which we did from like different angles.
Working with ceramics has influenced my practice overall. It influenced my inclination towards the tactile, both as my artistic practice as well as my curatorial practice. But my approach with ceramics has developed into something more interdisciplinary. So I would usually mix ceramics with texts or photographs or even moss. And for this show, I actually tried combining it with salt. I dove into like the history of Philippine ceramics in terms of like trade, and as well as the larger history of porcelain production. But from what I know, the clay here is like really iron rich. That's why most of the clay bodies we have are like brown or orange and even black. So I think that's also why I wanted to have this contrast between the terracotta body that I used and the porcelain. I also reacted to the bit in the essay where it said that La Porcelanica didn't prosper because as a luxury product, it didn't appeal to Filipino customers, and um, they were more satisfied with the cheaper Japanese imports. So this is why I also found the Rusun jars. There's this repeated abandoning or displacement of local Philippine ware in favor of foreign wares. Since I kept on thinking about the lost knowledge and this gap in Philippine history after reading the essay, I started researching on the history of Philippine ceramics in terms of trade with Japan. I encountered this essay by Hadrian Mendoza, who's also a Filipino ceramicist. So in his essay, I read about the Rusun jars or Luzon jars, which were these highly prized vessels because they were the best containers for tea. So in Japanese texts that even predated the Spanish period, they recorded these trade expeditions to Luzon just to collect the Rusum jars. And these jars were even more precious than gold. Over the course of the history with Philippine pottery, with the advent of Chinese porcelain and cheaper wares both from Japan and China, the demand for local Philippine ware declined. And that's when these Rusun jars were then repurposed, well, specifically for like the Ilocos region. These Rusun jars were repurposed and fragmented to line salt beds. So this is where I also found the congruence of salt and porcelain. So these materials are both named white gold to confer the value of these materials. And then looking at the larger history of porcelain production, I also somehow delved into um, how Europe started producing porcelain in the 17th century. So that's when I found that it all started with industrial espionage. There was this um, French Jesuit who was sent over to Jingdezheng, which is like the porcelain capital of China. So he spent around 2 decades in that region just to collect information and that secret on how porcelain was produced. And then he sent back 2 letters, including these recipes and processes on how to make porcelain. And when these letters were published, that's when everybody else in Europe started to produce their own porcelain wares. And then the idea for the commonplace book actually came about when I found out that Josiah Wedgwood, his recipe for his jasperware was actually based on these letters, the recipes and these letters. And this also made me think how La Porcelanica should have had a commonplace book. I also discussed this with Jazz, how there's this lost knowledge that we could have had records of the porcelain bodies and all the processes that La Porcelanica was doing, because it's important for even for individual ceramicists to have a record of um, the recipes that they use and the processes that they do, just to be able to have a consistency in production. So more so for a factory, it should have had this kind of record. So that's also why I decided to make these excerpts on like a commonplace book. For the speculated designs for the vessels, I wanted to think about how what if La Porcelanica was given the time or opportunity to refine its design. So I based the design off of Japanese cloisonné enamelware, which is kind of similar to the design on the plate. So these wares were quite popular back in the turn of the century. Instead of using like the iris design, I decided to substitute it with Philippine flora, because I feel like these Philippine flora could have made its way somehow to the design if La Porcelanica had more time to develop its wares. The white piece, so it's made in porcelain, and that was I added this crystallization texture on the surface just to sort of like mimic um, a mound of salt. The terracotta piece with the salt that developed on the surface, it sort of embodies how with the history of Philippine ceramics and how porcelain took over local wares. It embodies both what happened with how like the resume jars were repurposed, but it's also like the salt as porcelain taking over the local material. It's housed in the mirror box because I wanted to create somehow to create and expand the space um, and sort of like mirror how salt beds look like. So yeah, it oscillates between the two materials, oscillates between porcelain as salt and salt as porcelain. And because there was this repeating abandoning of local wares in favor of um, foreign wares or porcelain. So I wanted to play around with that. I suppose the availability of materials influences the things that I make. I think this is why my practice has developed into a more interdisciplinary one. The memory of places, it influences what I'm inclined towards. I think one of the reasons why I was drawn towards the idea of the Rusun jars was because I was able to go to vegan and see how those Brunei jars were made and learn about the clay body that they use. Knowing Jazz for since like college, in general, I really relate to the fragmentation that he does in his other works and playing with the fragility of the material, like the pieces wherein he combines different fragments into a sculpture, just like the hanging pieces that he did. And then for Hannah, it was really interesting for me how her paintings complemented the mounds that I did. It's like the porcelain mound that I made it could have been something that was extracted from the mines. And it was really interesting how that all came together, even though we weren't able to really discuss it. Seeing everything in this space, how all the pieces sort of complemented each other and intersected with each other. Jazz's speculation on the designs intersected with my speculations with other vessels that La Porcelana could have made.
So if you have any questions, do send them in the chat so that I can read them and address them to the artists. Um, yeah, so maybe if while waiting for questions, um, I realized that during this exhibition, all of us actually were interested in recreating or reimagining the history of porcelain, and also in Jazz's words, how we wanted to fill in the gaps. And I guess my next question for the artists, especially emerging from this exhibition, is that how do you imagine then your practice to be contemporary, especially in ceramics? Like we all, I think throughout the exhibition, we all agree that um, there's a history to craft and there is a history to craft being cosmopolitan. And I think one of the arguments of the exhibition is that if there's a history, there's also a future and there's also a present. So I think I would love to hear from you guys what do you think makes your practice contemporary, especially in a form that is usually relegated as craft or traditional? How do you process that, the contemporaneity of your practice in ceramics? Yeah, just jump in, whoever wants to answer first.
I kind of think it's contemporary to have a sort of freedom in your use of material, like in Pam's work, like using the salt or or just having exhibitions where you're able to not just make work out of ceramics and also include like many different materials. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. How about Joseph or Pam? Or is this even, maybe another question is this even something that you um, are anxious about, like whether or not your work is contemporary? Maybe that's another side to that question also. Yeah, Joseph, you were gonna say something.
I think for me, sorry, it's really early here. Um, yeah, for me, I'm both anxious about the term contemporary because um, like where do you draw the line in terms of like uh, uh, ceramic practice in the 50s? Like um, I think historically we've had lots of earthenware um, works that we could see in the museum. And these earthenware pieces are low firing clay. And in terms of uh, concentrating with using porcelain, like according to Zabel's essay, which is more uh, like sonon, very translucent. Um, I think the fact that we're using it as a mode of expression and we're responding to a certain uh, mode of production that is blatantly rejecting the functionality of it, which is, like ceramic has always been associated with functional form. So, like with my work for this exhibition, even the source of the form was a functional or decorative object, I just try to interpret it where the exact function is not.
Yeah, thank you. So expression and also the mode of production, and also for Hannah, um, the materiality, the freedom to use materials. How about you, Pam? How do you think about being contemporary in relation to your practice in ceramics?
I guess I approach deciding whether or not I'm going to go with like a ceramic work or not. The concept usually has a lot to do with the ceramic pieces that I make. It has to be materially sound. I wouldn't usually just for the sake of making a ceramic sculpture, I wouldn't just decide to make a ceramic piece. The concept for the show has to tie in with the materials or processes that I decide to do. Like well, historically, ceramic pieces are archaeological materials in themselves. Sometimes I would decide to use the ceramic material as an archival material to create imprints of other histories. So there's a lot that goes into conceptualizing the pieces and like the whole process um, from start to finish. Even the firing process um, comes into play when I decide to create a piece, or even not even firing the piece, or just sticking with like this square piece. The porosity of the material, like with the terracotta piece, the porosity of the material also is taken into account, or even deciding to glaze or not to glaze. All those factors, I really try to decide if it will make sense for the concept of the show.
Thank you. So we have a question from the chat from Julia, and this question's for Joseph. Her question is, and I'll just read from the chat: why is Focatos 1 a standalone work compared to the other Focato series that are in sets? Is there a meaning behind it? She says. That's for you, Joseph.
Well, the whole series, Fukatos, these are the like color studies, kaolin rock that has been transformed to ceramics, and the title is actually from a Latin term meaning painted over, or uh, like even artificial, uh, even like say like uh, those terms are uh, what's behind the title. In terms of, I think the difference between the colored ones and the not colored ones, it's just more to uh, like play around the idea of display, because when I set my pieces, they're just like uh, fragments, and to make sense of it in terms of the exhibition space that I've never seen is, I think, something that is part of the process. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but yeah, it's more like a playful way of grouping the objects and speculating about the possibility of display, given that I've never been there.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Julia, for your question. We have another question from the chat, and this is addressed to everyone. From Moji: how or in what way is Philippine ceramics unique? So, how or in what way is Philippine ceramics unique? Maybe I'll start while you gather your thoughts. Maybe I think the what the exhibition um, reveals in many ways is that um, number one, that there are many histories to ceramics as a form, and also we can extend that to, I think, craft in general. I think that there's this tendency to assume that craft is static, that it just emerges and it stays the way it is for a long time. So I think that's what interested me in the Zobel essay also as a curator, because it like brings us to questions of how do we then historicize craft? How is craft modern, or how is craft contemporary, and how is craft cosmopolitan? So yeah, I don't think I answered the question, but I think that's one way to think about it, that there are histories of ceramics and also Philippine craft that we haven't um, explored as much yet. And I think this is one way to think about it, like craft without being um, absorbed by discourses on art, like Western discourses on art. And I think this is one interesting conversation to have. So yeah, how do you think is Philippine ceramics unique? Anyone, anybody?
I think we have some pretty unique like clay bodies, and I think like a lot of the artists, ceramic artists, refer to our history in terms of form. Like I often see like a lot of callbacks to like historical Filipino pottery, like the manunggul jar. Yeah.
Yeah, I was
Pam?
also going to mention the um, unique clay bodies that we use because the other ceramicists that I know who aren't based in Manila, the character of the regions where they're based comes about in the clay bodies because they would usually source the clay wherever they're based. So the innovations of Philippine ceramicists is really interesting. How the the materials, the available materials that they find influence the works that they do. Or with the case of like Ella Mendoza, I love how um, her works are political and how like the history ties into her works or like the current political climate also influences the works that she produces.
Joseph?
I think it also comes from the fact that um, studio studio painters or ceramists in the Philippines have certain limitations in terms of access certain like raw materials. For example, there are raw materials that you actually need to import to be able to create that clay body. So I think finding certain substitutes to incorporate with your clay or with your clay, yeah, it brings so much uh, like uniqueness in terms of like what you can produce with glaze and how you can create something, given that you don't have your own kiln. Like how do you account for logistics?
Yeah, I think that's a very good transition to our next question, which is from Kat. Um, as ceramicists, how much of your personal individual practices rely on the sense of community? Would you say it's vital or not in your mode of creations? I think this is a very important question, especially if you don't have your own kiln. I think we know that you need to wait, you need to talk to people who have kiln, and etc. But for you, how do you think about community in your practice? How does it play out in the way you process your work, or in the way you plan out exhibitions like this?
I think the ceramics community is super important. Like you wouldn't be able to thrive purely on your own as a ceramicist, especially like with what Jazz mentioned, with the availability of materials. um, you would really have to like ask other potters where they got their ingredients or what substitutes they can use, or like for in my case, I don't have my own kiln, so it's really important to have those um, potter friends who have their kilns, and we talk about like the firing schedules, and so I have to follow that schedule as well. So like production um isn't like solely isolated. So like or even with thinking about how you're going to create a certain work, sometimes you would really have to ask other ceramicists for advice on how to go about making the work that you want to do.
Thanks, Pam.
Yeah, I guess related to what Pam said, sharing information is really important because I think there's just so much like learning and like technique that you have to achieve, and it's so time consuming that everyone is so like willing and open. Everyone wants to share information with each other and share what they've learned. Yeah, and I just feel like ceramics is so much more of a community practice than something like painting, which people tend to do individually.
Because I also feel like there's so much to learn through mistakes as well.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah, so everyone's always just like sharing all of their like mistakes and everything. Yeah.
Joseph,
Yeah, I
you want
think
to add?
uh yeah, just to add what they've already said. Yeah, it's different in terms of envisioning a certain result. So you need to account for that time from like how you wanted a certain texture or certain shade of color. And if you have people around you, like they can advise, like maybe it's not work, so don't even bother to try it. Or maybe they have an existing um, inquiry that you can just add on to. And and in terms of firing as well, it's very important to have that kind of sense of community because it also speeds up things. Like, if, I mean, if you have a big kiln, it's better if you have other people who work there to fire, so you can see the results quick.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you for your responses. And thank you for everyone for joining us today. Uh, yeah, so the exhibition is still available for viewing online and on site. It's open until the 26th of March. So if you have time, please do visit. Um, I guess that's all for now. And thank you everyone for joining us again. Thank you to the artists and thank you to Silverlens Media team for organizing and planning this conversation. Bye guys.